It was Mother's Day, 1986, when 20 people set off to climb Oregon's Mount Hood. Teenagers, a priest, teachers, even a mother who wanted to watch her daughter chase the summit. By the end of the week, 9 of them would never come home. Think about that for a second. A school trip, something meant to build courage, teamwork, adventure, would instead become the deadliest tragedy in Mount Hood's history. But here's the part that shocked the entire climbing world. They weren't unprepared thrill seekers. They were students, led by trusted adults, following a tradition their school believed was safe. And yet, as the storm closed in, trust turned into a death sentence. Mount Hood rises more than 11,000 feet above sea level. That's like stacking 8 Empire State Buildings on top of each other. From Portland, it looks peaceful, almost inviting. But on its slopes, weather can change in minutes. One moment, calm skies. The next, hurricane winds. Now imagine being 15 years old. The snow is blinding, the wind is screaming, you're clinging to your ice axe, hoping the adults leading you know what to do. Would you keep going, or would you turn back? That's the impossible choice this group faced, and the decisions made in the next few hours would haunt families for decades. At Oregon Episcopal School in Portland, adventure wasn't an option. It was a requirement. Every sophomore had to complete something called base camp. Think of it as Outward Bound meets final exams, except instead of pencils and paper, you carried crampons, ice axes, and a sleeping bag. The philosophy was simple. Put teenagers in the wilderness, make them solve real problems, and they'd come back stronger. Outward Bound's founder, Kurt Hahn, once said, "The experience of helping a fellow man in danger tends to change the balance of power in a youth's inner life." And for years, the program worked. Hundreds of kids trudged up snowy ridges, learned teamwork, and returned home with stories of adventure. But the group that left on May 12, 1986, would write a different ending. Their leader was Father Thomas Goman, the school's chaplain. At 42, he was brilliant, deeply respected, and loved by students. They called him Ferder Tom, half father, half doctor. Because he was both a priest and a PhD, he could inspire kids with his words. But he also had a streak of recklessness that worried some. One student recalled him once swan diving off a cliff during a training exercise just to prove a point. He smashed into the rocks, came up bleeding, and brushed it off like nothing had happened. To the kids, it looked fearless. To others, it looked dangerous. Alongside him was Marion Horwell, Dean of Students. Warm, caring, determined to support her school. But she had never climbed a mountain in her life. And then there were the professionals. Ralph Summers, a young mountain guide, and Dees Duniak, an Outward Bound instructor. Between them, they were supposed to keep the group safe. 20 people in all, 15 students, 2 teachers, 1 guide, 1 chaplain, and 1 mother, who wanted to watch her daughter prove herself on the mountain. One of those students was Tasha Amy. She was 15 and nearly blind in 1 eye. Some thought that should have kept her off the climb, but she insisted. She would have been just downright insulted if anyone had suggested she not climb the mountain, a teacher later said. For her, this wasn't just a requirement, it was a matter of pride. Young, determined, and excited. They packed their helmets, carabiners, and ice axes. They climbed aboard a yellow school bus, buzzing with the nervous energy of kids about to test themselves against the elements. By sunrise the next day, they'd be gone, swallowed by a storm no one saw coming. The bus rumbled east from Portland, headlights cutting through the night, carrying them toward the hulking white pyramid of Mount Hood. For most of the students, this was the adventure they'd been waiting for all year. They trained for it, learning how to kick steps into hard snow, how to self-arrest if they fell, even how to perform basic first aid on the mountain. But no amount of classroom preparation could capture what it feels like to actually step onto a glacier in the dark at 6,000 feet, with only the moon and headlamps to light the way. For many of them, this was their first time at that altitude. Their nerves showed in quiet laughter, clumsy crampons, and whispered questions. What if I slip? What if I can't make it? At the front of the group, Father Goman radiated confidence. His job wasn't just to guide them, it was to make them believe they could do it. And they did. They trusted him. After all, he'd done this before. He was the adult priest, the one who knew. Behind him, Marion Horwell tried to keep her nerves hidden. She had no climbing background, but she believed in the program, and in Goman. If he said they could do it, then surely they could. And scattered among the students were different personalities. The natural athletes who looked like they were born to climb. The nervous ones who lagged behind. The determined kids like Tasha Amy, who weren't gonna let anyone, or anything, tell them they didn't belong. It was supposed to be a single-day climb. Up by noon, down by afternoon, back in Portland that evening, ready to tell stories in the cafeteria the next day. But as they stepped off the bus at Timberline Lodge, ice axes in hand, a quiet warning already hung in the air. The forecast had mentioned a storm. The mountain was calm now, but anyone who knows Mount Hood will tell you, calm doesn't last, and the storm that was coming would change their lives forever. At 2:30 in the morning, May 12th, 1986, the team clipped on their crampons, adjusted their headlamps, and began the long push-up Mount Hood's south side. At first, the world was silent, just the crunch of boots in snow and the occasional gust of wind. The summit seemed possible, maybe even easy. By dawn, the mountain was glowing in soft light. From below, Hood looked serene, but higher up, clouds began to gather. The forecast had already warned of incoming weather. Matt Zaffino, then a young meteorologist, later said, "Any Mount Hood veteran should have known a big storm can turn the peak into a death zone without warning. When it hits fast." But at that moment, the students couldn't see the danger yet. They laughed, they snapped pictures, they pushed upward. Then came the first sign that not everyone was ready. Hillary Spray, just 15 years old, felt a wave of nausea. Her stomach cramped, and she couldn't keep pace. Her mother, Sharon, who had joined the climb just to be with her daughter, decided they would both turn back. They retraced their steps, watching the rest of the group fade into the white distance. Years later, Sharon said she could still hear the muffled sound of their boots. Growing quieter with every step, the climb continued. At the Silcox Hut, about 7,000 feet, 2 more students fell behind. Cramps, exhaustion, doubt. They too turned back. A little higher, outward bound instructor, Dee Zduniak, suffering from snow blindness, made her own decision. She would return to Timberline Lodge alone. From 20, the group was now just 13. And as Zduniak made her way down, the storm began to arrive. Clouds swallowed the mountain. Winds rose. Visibility shrank to just a few feet. What had been a clear route only hours before became a white maze of disorientation. The mountain had changed its face, and the real fight for survival was only beginning. By late morning, the storm was no longer creeping in. It was here. Winds screamed across the slopes at over 100 miles an hour, the force of a Category 2 hurricane. Snow blasted sideways, erasing footprints almost as soon as they were made. Guide Ralph Summers felt the dread in his gut. He later admitted he told Father Goman, "We need to get out of here." But by then, the group had already drifted off course. Visibility was down to 10, maybe 20 feet. In that blinding white, there is no horizon, no up or down, just endless snow. And then, the youngest climber, 15-year-old Patrick McGinnis, began to stumble. His speech slurred. He begged to lie down and sleep. Classic hypothermia. Imagine watching your child, someone you'd just seen laughing on a school bus, suddenly collapse in the snow, his body shutting down. Would you push him to move or let him rest, knowing that rest in that cold was a death sentence? The group tried to descend, but each step felt like walking in circles. Hours slipped away. By late afternoon, Summers realized the truth. They weren't going to make it out before nightfall. Not with Patrick collapsing, not with visibility gone. So he gave the only order left: dig. The students hacked at the ice with shovels and axes, carving into the mountainside. They built a snow cave, a white coffin in waiting, crammed with bodies pressed against each other for warmth. Snow piled at the entrance, sealing them in sight. Oxygen dwindled. Outside, the mountain roared. Inside, silence grew heavier. Some wondered, had they dug in too soon? Should they have pushed lower? But no one would ever know. By the time darkness swallowed Mount Hood, 13 lives were balanced on the thin walls of a snow cave. And before dawn, 3 of them would vanish into the blizzard, never to return alive. Inside that cave, the hours stretched like days. 13 people, shoulder to shoulder, pressed together in the suffocating dark. Their breath clouded the air, moisture freezing on the icy walls, until everything dripped and cracked around them. At first, there was relief. They'd carved out shelter. They'd beaten back the wind and snow. But soon, the cave revealed its flaws. It was too small for so many bodies. The entrance kept clogging with fresh snow, choking off oxygen. Some inside grew dizzy, lightheaded. The cave that was supposed to save them was slowly becoming a trap. And then came the hardest part. As the storm raged, 3 students made a desperate decision. They would try to break free and head down the mountain on their own. Maybe they thought they could find help. Maybe they just couldn't stand another minute buried alive. We'll never know their true thoughts, because by the time rescuers arrived, those 3 were found frozen, sprawled in the snow not far from the cave. Jackets missing, gloves stripped away, victims of a cruel twist of hypothermia called paradoxical undressing. Their bodies believed they were burning hot, when in reality, they were dying in the cold. For the others who stayed behind, time blurred. Hunger gnawed at them. Fingers and toes grew numb. Some slipped in and out of consciousness, and still, they waited. Every hour, the snow pressed harder on the walls. Every breath felt thinner. Some whispered prayers. Others went silent, but no one outside knew where they were, or if they were even alive. The second night fell, and with it came silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that gnaws at your chest. The silence of bodies too weak to speak. Hours bled into days. Students who had once joked on the bus now lay barely moving, breath so faint it was hard to tell if they were still alive. Somewhere in that cave, two teenagers, Brenton Clark and Giles Thompson, clung to the thinnest thread of life. Thompson, only 15, drifted in and out of consciousness, frostbite eating away at his legs. Clark, exhausted and starving, still forced himself to stay awake. Imagine being in his shoes, surrounded by friends slipping away, pressed against them in the dark, trying to will your body to survive when everything inside screamed to let go. Meanwhile, outside, the storm showed no mercy. For 3 days, the mountain held its prisoners, and search teams scoured the wrong slopes. Helicopters hovered, rescue dogs searched, but the whiteouts swallowed every trace. And then, a break. A guide's statement, a flare dropped from a helicopter, and finally the rescuers closed in on the right spot. When they broke through the snow cave, the scene was unbearable. 7 students and 2 adults were gone. Only Clark and Thompson were alive. Thompson's frostbite was so severe that doctors would later amputate both his legs. But he lived. Clark too survived. Think about that. 13 went into that cave. 11 never walked out. The mountain had made its choice. On the morning of May 13th, phones began to ring across Portland. Parents were told the climb was delayed. Then another call came. The students hadn't returned at all. By dawn, search and rescue teams were mobilized, headlights cutting across the parking lot at Timberline Lodge. The storm hadn't eased. Winds howled so fiercely that one snowcat, those tank-like rescue machines built for mountains, was flipped on its side like a toy. Volunteers staggered through whiteout conditions, avalanche probes in hand, sweeping the slopes for any sign of life. But the mountain offered nothing. Inside Timberline Lodge, the parents gathered. They sat in silence at long wooden tables, clutching coffee they didn't drink. The dining hall, usually filled with laughter from skiers, had become a waiting room for grief. One father later remembered, "It was so quiet. If you said anything, it echoed around the room. You'd hear someone crying. Can you imagine it? Knowing your child is out there somewhere, in the cold, in the storm, and you're helpless." Hours tick by. No news, just silence, and then a break. By the second day, 2 figures emerged from the blizzard, survivors who had left the main group earlier. They stumbled down toward rescuers and delivered the first clear message. The others were trapped in a snow cave higher up the mountain. At last, rescuers had hope. But finding them in a storm like that, it was like searching for a buried coin in a field of snow. And time was already running out. By the 3rd day, frustration was boiling over. Teams had probed thousands of square feet, only to be pulled away again and again. Snow fell harder, covering tracks as soon as they were made. Even helicopters circling above couldn't pinpoint the missing climbers. Then came a turning point. Master Sergeant Richard Harder, part of the Air Force Pararescue Squadron, looked out from a helicopter and realized the searchers were in the wrong place. He fired a flare into a new field of snow, marking where he believed the cave must be. Dozens of rescuers lined up, shoulder to shoulder, driving their avalanche poles into the drifts. And then, one pole struck something solid, a hollow sound beneath the snow. Shouts rang out. Rescuers dug frantically, clawing through ice and powder until an opening appeared. What they found inside was devastating. The cave was jammed with bodies, teenagers pressed together, lifeless, blue with cold. But 2 still clung to life, Brenton Clark and Giles Thompson. They were rushed down the mountain by helicopter, straight to Portland hospitals. Doctors worked desperately. Clark would survive. Thompson would too, but both his legs had to be amputated. For the families waiting at Timberline, the news came in fragments. First, the discovery of bodies. Then, the confirmation of names. One father recalled hearing it over a police radio while staring up at Mount Hood, now glowing in sunshine, as if the mountain itself had washed clean. 9 lives lost, 7 students, 2 teachers, a nation stunned, and one school community changed forever. But the hardest questions were still to come. Who was to blame? And could it all have been prevented? When the storm cleared, Mount Hood returned to its postcard beauty. Blue sky, gleaming summit, sunlight bouncing off the snow as if nothing had happened. But below, the grief was just beginning. 9 funerals, 9 families shattered, and a school community that could never be the same. Parents asked the question every parent would: why? Why were their children taken up a mountain with a storm so clearly in the forecast? The official inquest didn't take long to find fault. It placed the blame squarely on Father Thomas Goman. Investigators said he failed to turn back when the warnings were obvious. They concluded that stubbornness, misplaced confidence, and an unwillingness to disappoint his students cost lives. Some defended him, arguing he was beloved, that he truly thought they could beat the storm, but others couldn't forgive. To them, he wasn't just a leader who made a mistake. He was a man who gambled with children's lives. The school itself faced lawsuits. Most families settled quietly, but one refused. They went to court and won, with the jurors awarding them $500,000. That verdict stamped an ugly word onto the tragedy: negligence. For the parents, though, no amount of money could bring peace. Some marriages crumbled. Others buried their grief in silence. One father admitted years later, "I hit the vodka heavier than I should have. I threw things. I went through counselors just trying to keep breathing." The disaster wasn't just about those who died. It rippled outward, wrecking futures, friendships, even faith. But even through the wreckage, 2 survivors had to face something no teenager ever should: the weight of living when so many of their friends did not. For survivors, the climb didn't end on the mountain. It followed them for decades. Giles Thompson, who lost both his legs to frostbite, became a living reminder of how thin the line between life and death had been. Brenton Clark, the other survivor, carried the invisible weight of memory, the voices that went quiet in that cave, the friends he would never see again. And then there were the parents, each left to battle grief in their own way. Some spoke openly, others shut down. Patrick McGinnis's father, Frank, admitted that for years he couldn't even say his son's name without breaking. "There's a difference between knowing loss and accepting loss," he said. "I had to own what had happened, then figure out how to live my life." Every May since 1987, Oregon Episcopal School has gathered in silence to remember. Students, teachers, parents, more than 1,000 people, stand at the base of a bell tower as 9 names are read aloud. With each name, the bell tolls once, echoing across the campus. Patrick, Tasha, Susan, Allison, Richard, Eric, Aaron, Marion, Tom. 9 tolls, 9 lives. A reminder that adventure, courage, and trust can sometimes end in tragedy. And yet, as painful as the memories are, the climb is not forgotten. It's woven into the school's identity, into its scars. But Mount Hood doesn't mourn. It stands unmoved, beautiful, silent, dangerous. The mountain doesn't care about blame. It doesn't care about grief. It only waits for the next climbers to come. What lingers from 1986 isn't just the heartbreak. It's the lessons carved into the mountain's icy slopes. Mount Hood looks gentle from Portland, rising like a guardian over the city. But don't be fooled. In the past century, more than 120 people have died here, a number that rivals giants like Denali or Mount Washington. And the dangers aren't exotic. They're simple, brutal, and fast. Avalanches, falls, storms that explode out of nowhere. That's why leadership matters. On any climb, there comes a moment when turning back is the bravest decision you can make. But it's also the hardest. Pride whispers just a little farther. Group pressure says, don't be the one who quits. And the mountain, well, the mountain doesn't whisper. It roars. Ask yourself, if you were standing there high above the tree line, wind slicing across your face, and the leader said, "We can make it," would you dare to disagree? Or would you follow, hoping he's right? That's the trap those students faced. They trusted their leader. And trust in the wrong storm can be deadly. The legacy of Mount Hood's tragedy isn't that kids were too weak. It's that nature was too strong and the adults underestimated it. Every climber since has been forced to remember, the mountain doesn't care about your plans, your schedules, or your pride. And for Oregon Episcopal School, the memory became a permanent scar. Every student who walks its halls hears the story, not as a warning against adventure, but as a reminder that courage without caution can cost everything. For the survivors, the tragedy became more than a story. It became a compass for the rest of their lives. Giles Thompson, who lost both legs, rebuilt his world one step at a time. His survival wasn't just about endurance on the mountain. It was about refusing to let that night define him. Brenton Clark, the other survivor, carried quieter scars. Living when so many of your friends did not, that's a burden that doesn't melt away with spring snow. The parents too found their own ways forward. Some carried anger, some carried silence, and some carried faith that their children's lives, though short, still mattered. One father said, "I like to think he'd be a choir director somewhere." Simple words, but loaded with the weight of an unlived future. Each May, when the bell tolls 9 times on the Oregon Episcopal campus, the community doesn't just mourn, they remember. They stand together in grief and resilience, reminding every generation that adventure requires respect, that storms don't negotiate, and that memory is both painful and sacred. Mount Hood hasn't changed. Its white summit still shines in the morning sun, drawing climbers with promises of glory. But hidden in its beauty is the lesson of 1986. Nature gives and nature takes. And if you forget that, even for a moment, it will remind you harshly. So the legacy of this disaster isn't only tragedy. It's a warning carved in ice. A story told so the next group of climbers might turn back when the storm rolls in. A reminder that no summit, no matter how close, is worth 9 lives. On May 12, 1986, 20 people stepped onto Mount Hood. By May 15th, 11 had been pulled from a snow cave, 9 of them gone forever. Their names are read every spring at Oregon Episcopal School, one by one, each followed by the toll of a bell that echoes through the campus. Patrick, Tasha, Susan, Allison, Richard, Eric, Aaron, Marion, Tom. 9 lives cut short on a mountain that towers just over 11,000 feet. A mountain so close to Portland that on a clear day, you can see it while pumping gas or driving to work. To think such horror could unfold within sight of the city, it's almost impossible to believe. But that's the truth of mountains. They look calm from far away, but up close, they demand respect. They don't forgive mistakes, they don't bargain, and they never ever care how young you are. If there's one lesson carved from this tragedy, it's this. Adventure will always carry risk, but it's the choices we make, the moment we turn back or push forward, that decide who lives to tell the story. Mount Hood still stands, silent and beautiful, its summit gleaming in the sun. But for those who remember 1986, that beauty will always carry a shadow. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing on a mountain isn't the storm. It's the belief that it can't happen to you.